The geopolitics itself is not going to lead to actual membership. The vector is the geopolitics.
The occupation first, membership second.
Or together. And painting this picture was very much an occupation of the Russian propagandists. The 2030 could be, the time counts in different increments in Ukraine. What takes somewhere else month takes weeks here or days.
Katarina, I'm really happy to see you here in Kiev in this new capacity. We had many chance to talk before because you were dealing with Ukraine.
I have been working with and dealing with Ukraine for many, many years, really since 2015, and coming to Ukraine many times. But it's really an immense honor and pleasure to actually be here as the ambassador of the European Union.
Ви українську вже вивчили?
Трошки. Я розумію. But I think that I will need to take some intense lessons in Ukrainian to be comfortable speaking, but I understand.
You have just presented your credentials to President Zelensky, and probably it was like first lesson not only of Ukrainian language but of communication with Ukrainian authorities on a very high level.
I have met President Zelensky on a number of occasions. I was actually at his inauguration, and the last time I met him was in November of last year, when he actually gave me an Ardien, gave me a state decoration. So that was a very emotional one. So yesterday was also a very, very emotional ceremony, very solemn, very nice ceremony. He said, "Glad to see you back, Katarina." So that was a very nice welcome. And along with President Zelensky, they were also his collaborators, Mr. Yermak, Minister Kuleba, Mr. Zhovko and Mr. Sibiha. I very much hope that Ukraine will finalize its work on the 7 steps, the famous 7 steps that were outlined in our opinion in June of 2022, when Ukraine was given a candidate status along with Moldova. And President also in our bilateral meeting yesterday was saying that in another month he expects that those remaining measures will be taken, and I trust and believe that the EU leaders will take the decision to open negotiations in December. I hope that step will be taken. Then the issue of actual membership, that's going to take some time, because there is a lot of sometimes exciting, sometimes boring requirements that a country has to go through. But what is really important is to have the political signal of opening negotiations.
I very much understand that diplomats hate to name any dates, but you are free at least to refer to what President Michel has said. And he said that 2030 is the year when the EU have to be ready for future accessions. Is that realistic to fulfill all what Ukraine needs if Ukraine does what it has to do to reach that goal by 2030?
Well, look, for a country to join the EU, a lot of reforms have to take place. But if there is anything that is extraordinarily inspiring about your country, is that things can happen fast. Especially since the escalation of the war, since the invasion of last February, I was telling everybody in Brussels that the time counts in different increments in Ukraine. What takes somewhere else month takes weeks here or days, etc. So I think that the 2030 could be realistic if one really works hard. Now, to maintain a reform tempo, it's not always a linear process, but I can imagine that being realistic. But it's not only reforms that Ukraine needs to undertake that are going to define the timing, but also the institutional and policy changes that need to take place on the side of the European Union to be ready to expand beyond the current 27. Without changes to the voting system, to the decision-making system, that number is not infinitely expandable. And therefore, I think it's important to realize that not only Ukraine needs to reform, but also the European Union institutionally and in terms of policies. And that's not easy.
Some people expect geopolitical decisions, not something based on reforms. What would you say to them?
Well, I think that geopolitics come into play very much. Otherwise, we wouldn't be discussing it. I mean, there's no question that we would not have this debate about when and how Ukraine comes into the EU if it wasn't for the terrible events of 24th of February and what followed. So the geopolitics, of course, enters, is that the vector is the geopolitics. But there are a number of fundamental reforms to help the country modernize and technical requirements that also need to be done. So the geopolitics itself is not going to lead to actual membership there, because there is a lot of things that need to happen in the meantime.
You have referred that during your conversation with President Zelensky, you discussed some outstanding issues, those 7 criteria. Could you name those? What do we need to do to know our homework?
Well, yesterday's discussion with President Zelensky was on the occasion of the credential ceremony, so this was not a technical discussion. This would not have been the place to
But you know those 7
technical issues. Yes, I think that there is a lot of work that has happened to fulfill the 7 criteria or the 7 steps. There have been Some of them have been already fulfilled. For example, the requirements on the reinstatement of the judicial governance bodies, the High Council of Justice and the High Qualification Commission, and others, the media law, etc. So there are some things that already have been completed, and I think we have also had very important progress on the anti-corruption criteria, and also the reinstatement of the asset declaration. So I think that there has been a lot of progress. I think that in terms of the anti-money laundering framework, there is still outstanding the famous law on politically exposed persons, and there is also an evaluation ongoing on the steps related to national minorities.
There is a kind of stereotype. Ukraine stands by the word corruption. We used to hear that for many years. In Ukraine, it is more or less clear that it's a stereotype, which is not that much based on reality. But do you see that this connection is changing among international representatives?
I think that Ukraine indeed was marred by systemic corruption in the years prior to Maidan. I mean, I think the spectacular discoveries about the wealth of the previous president before Maidan, etc., were testimony to that, the oligarchic structures, etc. But let's also not forget that this was an area, and painting this picture was very much an occupation of the Russian propagandists, because it worked with the Western audience. And indeed, Ukraine had been equated with corruption. And I think that while some of it was justified by reality, some of it was, the extent of it, I think, was not fair. And there has been a lot of reforms already. You have a whole architecture of anti-corruption entities. They're carrying out investigations. They're prosecuting people. Judges are adjudicating corruption cases. So this picture is certainly changing. But I think the biggest change that happened, is now, during the escalation of the war. I think what has really changed is the societal expectations, the expectations of ordinary Ukrainians, that they are not putting their lives to recreate old Ukraine. They are putting their lives to create a modern, new, non-corrupt country, and I think the basis is there. You asked me about the image in the West. I think it's changing. It's very much changing, and a very simple reason is that very few people expected Ukraine and Ukrainians to be holding up this well against such pressure as this terrible war. And if you had so thoroughly a corrupt system as the picture was painted, it would have fallen like a house of cards, and it didn't. So I think there is a new appreciation and an understanding of Ukraine as a country that functions in the face of terrible war, and let me just come back to underpinning the message that the society has changed. And if you see it from every poll that you look at, the expectations of people are different. So therefore the public pressure is there.
Our partner and friend Moldova, which is also moving towards EU membership, says that they are sure, or they were assured by EU authorities, that they can become the EU member without the occupation of Transnistria. Ukraine has not that much similar, but anyway, a problem with occupied territories. So in Ukraine, this question also arises. How do you see, is that possible to become the EU member, full-fledged EU member, before we reach end of the conflict with Russia?
Well, look, I'm not sure that Moldova would have received any reassurance from anybody in the EU along these lines. I would say, on the contrary, the experience of some of the previous enlargement is that you don't want in the EU a territorial conflict. So I think the EU would be cautious on that front. But what I can very easily see is that the enlargement dynamic and the prospect of joining the EU could become an important incentive for reintegration. In other words, the prospect of actually joining the EU, both the left and right bank of the Dniester River, could be the motivation for the reintegration. I would rather see it that way rather than bringing in a country with a territorial dispute.
So rather the occupation first, membership second?
Or together.
Yeah. And with Ukraine?
Well, I mean, look, with Ukraine, the issue is one of an active war. The good news is that the actual process of getting ready for enlargement takes some time, and hopefully the territorial disputes would be resolved by then.
I have to ask quite a difficult question, because I'm not that happy to ask it at all. In Ukraine, we all understand that during the war we have to have some limitations, like marathon, which replaced TV channels, like limited political freedom, which some people afraid can replace political pluralism. Do you have a message to Ukrainian authorities? What have to be changed, or where Ukraine have to be cautious about?
But look, Ukraine is in an active state of war. You are under martial law because, my first and second night of moving to Kiev, I had to go to the shelter at night. So I think that in such a situation, the limitations seem justified, as you mentioned. I mean, of course, looking at the situation of peace and normalcy, I think that the democratic expectations, the pluralism expectations, citizens' freedoms, media freedoms are an expectation that Ukraine will be held to.
To finalize, let's shortly explain what will happen when, because I expect when and not if, when Ukraine starts membership negotiations. What is it? So it means that Zelensky sits next to Michel and they discuss something or not?
Well, enlargement negotiations are technically conducted by the European Commission. So the top negotiator would be President von der Leyen, but the actual negotiations are conducted not at the presidential level. Normally, typically, what happens there that the European Commission nominates a chief negotiator, and the same would happen on the side of the negotiating country, and they would have teams that then look at sectoral issues. Some of the very sensitive issues would be then elevated to political level, which on the side of the Commission is the Commissioner for Enlargement. On the side of the Ukrainian government, presumably, Ukrainian authorities, presumably Prime Minister, there may be some very sensitive issues that then go to the presidential level, but that would not be their day-to-day business. But something I would like to mention are two elements. One is that technically it's done by the Commission, but every step of moving further through the different chapters, different clusters, different deadlines, they have to be approved by the member states. And the member states in unanimity. So that's a very important message, that to proceed in the enlargement process, one has to really make sure that bilateral disputes don't enter the discussion, that there is possibility of reaching this unanimous verdicts every time.
And I remember that last time when this unanimity was needed was last year when we have got candidate status, yes. And 7 criteria appeared. So we have to expect new 7 criteria multiple times.
Believe me, once you start negotiations, there are going to be not only 7, there are going to be multiple of that, various criteria. And this is the second point I wanted to say. It's a little bit misleading to call the process negotiations, because the word negotiation means there is a give and take. Whereas in the case of joining the European Union, there is a massive body of laws, regulations, directives, the rules that bind the European Union together, and the country that is trying to join has to adopt all of that. The actual negotiations are usually typically around the transition periods that you can negotiate to have to adopt this or that requirement. For example, I don't know, environmental cleanup, or whatever in the past, whatever the issues were that were very difficult to do for the acceding countries, you negotiate these transition periods. But in terms of being bound by the full body of EU norms and regulations, that's not really up to negotiation.
So looking forward to have fast but effective process of those negotiations, I mean reforms in Ukraine. And I very much hope that even being here as ambassador, you would witness that Ukraine would be ready for the EU accession. And я дякую вам за те, що ви додивилися це інтерв'ю, і сподіваюся, що вам сподобалося. Лишайтеся з нами на каналі Європейської правди, каналі про Європу, НАТО та місце України у світі. До побачення.
Я дякую.